Hi, I'm Colleen Cafaro, a partner at Canaan, an early-stage venture capital firm. Today, I'm going to try to give you a window into how early-stage VCs think. I'd like to begin by briefly introducing you to my firm. Canaan's been around for 34 years, and we're currently investing out of our 12th fund, which is an $800 million fund. We are diversified in that we invest across both traditional technology and healthcare. I focus on healthcare, specifically early-stage biopharma companies. And we are early-stage investors and focus on seed and Series A at the time of our initial investment. To start off, I'd like to define what venture capital is. As you can see from this definition taken directly from Wikipedia, venture capital is a type of private equity. So what is private equity? In defining what it is, I will also define what it is not. So starting with the private piece, the companies that we invest in are privately held companies and are differentiated from those listed on public stock exchanges like the NASDAQ or New York Stock Exchange, where there's a marketplace where the shares of the company can freely be bought and sold. The private companies that we invest in don't have such a system for buying and selling shares, and therefore we consider these long-term investments and we hold them for several years. Equity is differentiated from other funding forms such as debt and grants. With equity, in exchange for the funding, the company will issue shares to the funder. So the venture capital firm or investor becomes a shareholder in the company and owns part of the company. Grants, which you just heard about in the previous talk, specifically SBIR and STTR, is a form of funding where the company does not have to issue stock to the funder in exchange for the funding, nor do they have to repay the funding. Debt is a type of funding that acts like a loan, where you do have to repay the funding in a certain amount of time and at certain terms. Now that we've defined what venture capital is, I'll explain how the cycle of venture capital works and what the job of a partner at a venture capital firm is. So we, the investors or partners in a firm, will set out to raise a fund. I mentioned that Canaan's currently investing out of our 12th fund, so we've now done this 12 times. The partners in the firm will go out to a set of investors, which are called our limited partners, and often consist of institutional investors like pension plans, endowments, and family offices. And we raise the fund, which we then aim to invest in a series of companies which constitutes that portfolio. We undergo a rigorous evaluation process for each company that we're considering investing in, and that's the due diligence process. Over about a 3-year period, we identify the companies that we want to invest in. And as I mentioned on the last slide, in exchange for the funding that we offer to the companies, we're issued stock and we become a shareholder in the company. We're also very active investors and usually take a seat on the board of directors of the company so that we can play an active role in the company's strategy and help to make the company successful. Our goal, of course, is to generate a return on our investment, and there are really two main paths to doing that. The first is for the company to go through an initial public offering or IPO. As I mentioned on the last slide, once the company is listed on a public stock exchange, our shares become liquid and we have a way to sell those shares. The alternative path is an M&A or merger and acquisition, which is a sale of a company. In either case, we're able to liquidate our shares and hopefully return the initial investment at a multiple of what we initially invested, generating a return, which we call a realized capital gain. We then distribute the profits back to our investors who provided the funding in the first place. And so a successful fund that generates a return to our limited partners or our investors enables them to want to sign up again for our next fund and so the cycle continues. Different funds have different models, and it's important to know as an entrepreneur what the model of a particular fund that you're pitching to is, and don't be afraid to ask. So let's take the example of a $500 million fund. It's the expectation that limited partners will be looking for a return of 3x or greater. So the partners in that fund have the job of turning $500 million into $1.5 billion or greater over a 10-year time period. So how can you do that? There are several different ways, and there's no right or wrong answer, but each fund has its own model. So in one example, you could invest in 25 companies, and with $500 million, that means you could average $20 million into each company. So you would need to generate a return of $60 million from each company to get to your $1.5 billion in total. Now, for each company that fails, because we are in a high-risk business and we know there are failures, you'd need another company to generate a $120 million return to make up for the whole, and so on and so forth for each failure or loss in the portfolio. An alternative model would be to invest in more companies, but to put less money into each. So you could think of a scenario where you might take a $500 million fund and invest in 50 new companies with $10 million each. In that case, you would need a return of $30 million per company. And again, for each loss in the portfolio, you would need another company to generate a $60 million return. The point of this is to illustrate for you the math that venture capitalists are constantly thinking about in our heads and how to generate these returns. Because to keep the venture capital cycle going, we need to generate a return for our investors to enable us to raise the next fund. And as I said, there are many different models, and it's important to know when you're pitching to investors what their model is. Now, I'd like to briefly tell you what the process of due diligence looks like. So after an initial introduction by email, where we would review a non-confidential slide deck, we would determine our level of interest in having an initial meeting, which can be done by phone, Zoom, or in person. After the initial meeting, if we remain interested, we would typically begin our due diligence process, which would take place over weeks to months, where we dig in on several different criteria, which I will very quickly cover in the next 2 slides. Over a series of meetings with the company and outside experts, we conduct our due diligence across a range of criteria, which I will cover briefly now. The foundation of any biopharmaceutical company is the science and technology, so we will spend a significant amount of time getting a solid understanding of that. Intellectual property diligence is something we reserve for after a signed term sheet and typically engage an IP law firm. We'll reference check the team and make sure that the team has experience that's relevant for the endeavor. We'll review any preclinical data that's available in terms of both efficacy and safety, and it will evaluate the chemistry, manufacturing, and controls. So this includes the manufacturing process, cost of goods, etc. Likewise, we will evaluate the regulatory and clinical path required to get a drug approved in a particular therapeutic area. We will want to understand if the path has been paved by others before, or if no drug is approved and it's not understood what would be required. If there is a path paved, we will evaluate what the length of the typical clinical trials are, what the endpoints are, if they're quantitative or subjective, and determine how difficult we think the clinical and regulatory path is. We will evaluate what the market size is, how severe the unmet medical need is, what the natural history of disease and standard of care are, what the competitive landscape looks like, and what the commercialization strategy might be. Importantly, we think a lot about the exit strategy and how a return on investment can be made. Recall that the 2 paths are IPO or a sale of the company through a merger and acquisition. So we will review what comparable companies have been able to generate for value in terms of IPO and M&A in recent years. All of these criteria roll up into our assessment of where the risks are for a company. In early stage investing, we believe that every company has risks, and it's just important to understand where the risks are and how they might be addressed and when we might have answers to the biggest questions. We then make an assessment of how successful we think the company can be, and if successful, what the company may be valued at, and how we can generate a return that will be meaningful for our fund. And this is really how we think. So thank you so much for your time and attention today. I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Hello everyone, my name is Christy Schaefer and I'm with Hatteras Venture Partners based in North Carolina. I'm pleased to be here today at this workshop and to be teaming up with Colleen of Canaan. We've been through a number of pitches over our careers, and I myself am a scientist by training and have been a public and a private company CEO, so I know the complexities and challenges of raising money, particularly in the early startup phase. I'd like to give you a little bit of information about the firm Hatteras, which is based in North Carolina. We invest on the East Coast primarily, but also across the country, and we love to work with early academic science, particularly with great scientists who may have obtained a lot of NIH funding or SBIR grants as they're forming companies, and who are looking for someone to partner with, both in terms of financially as well as to collaborate on how to develop these products and get them all the way from a early stage thought process to the clinic and beyond. We have over 20 years of experience and $600 million under management, and we are particularly excited about all of the new science in the immuno-oncology and oncology. What I'd like to do today is give you a real-world case study or example of how the perfect pitch was translated, and one that I had a personal experience with called G1 Therapeutics. We invested seed money in 2013, right at the time the academic scientists were beginning to test the hypothesis, and they had gained about $5 million of NIH funding to move the product forward. But they needed a lot of help. They did not have a solid team in place, and they needed both money and know-how to move it forward. Here I want to show you that with a lot of hard work since 2013, the product not only moved through the clinic and obtained breakthrough designation from the FDA, but it just gained FDA approval. The product trilaciclib, or Cosela, has now been approved as the first and only myeloprotective therapy to decrease the incidence of chemotherapeutic-induced myelosuppression. It's a very exciting product, and there were complexities along the way, in particular because no one had ever done anything quite like this, but it was well worth the journey. This slide shows you how G1 was able to convince us in the early days by having a pitch that really stood out. And I want to focus on the left-hand side of the slide to demonstrate that when you have early data that is very clear, robust, and statistically significant, like G1 had in this animal model, where they demonstrated that their molecules could affect more than one cell type in terms of myelopreservation, it really captures the interest of a venture group. It, in fact, was a wow factor, and this slide was used over and over again as we raised more capital all the way to the IPO. Of course, what we were banking on was that this preclinical data would be translated in the clinic, and it, in fact, was, and is why the drug was actually approved by the FDA. So what happens beyond that wow factor? And let's assume that you can do that. There are a number of specific do's and don'ts that I would recommend for a highly effective pitch. First, as you know, we're seeking novel, innovative science, but it's also helpful if there is robust intellectual property or some patents around the technology. We also help companies obtain that and work with you and the IP firm that you've chosen, or help you choose a stronger firm to do so. But it's important to be able to conceptualize that you could gain patents to really protect this product opportunity for a significant period of time. And then, of course, we want to understand the development pathway. In particular, we'd like for it to be as efficient as possible, and this often requires going to the FDA to have meaningful conversations about what would be required, especially if there are no precedents, like in the case of G1. And then we need to understand that high unmet medical need, and you need to be able to articulate how it will be differentiated from anything else, either in the clinic or currently on the market. And then finally, we're looking for strong teams. That is not always in place if it's very early stage. Sometimes it's very strong academic scientists, but they have day jobs like you all do. And so they're looking for industry veterans to help them or consultants. In the case of G1, I was able to step in to the team as executive chair of the board, which effectively was the CEO for over a year. And this small amount of money we put in with their NIH funding and with my involvement was able to really propel us beyond a first pre-IND meeting with the FDA, multiple molecules, selection of a lead candidate, and into the pre-IND pharmacology and toxicology studies. In order to have an effective pitch, you need to cover certain key topics, which I think are obvious here, but I want to focus on bullet point 2, which is to be able to demonstrate that you can efficiently develop an R&D process to reach certain key milestones that might be pharmacology and early non-GLP toxicology work, or a pre-IND meeting with the FDA. That's really critical so that we can understand bite-sized chunks of what you'll be doing and how much it will cost. In addition, of course, to the novel science and articulating the patient population you'll be studying, why there's an unmet need, and to have at least a formative team in place. We need to have reasons to believe, and so by presenting your technology overview in a clear and impactful manner, that will be tremendously helpful. And if you have any validation from the NIH, for example, through funding, we believe that's highly selective process and extremely helpful, in addition to any publications or presentations at scientific conferences. You'll need to be prepared to discuss any patents and or licensing information from the university, but that usually comes a little bit later. First, you need to convince us that the science makes sense and that it can be translated into the clinic. Please don't do the following: provide too much data, an overload, so that the main message is lost, or overstate what the data means, or hide failed studies which will be only uncovered during the due diligence process, and keep the story as simple as possible. A pro tip here is to try to run your pitch in the early days of creating it by an astute non-scientist who you can trust, who is candid, and will tell you whether they understand the story, whether the messages and takeaways are clear or not. They often can be very insightful in terms of putting together a very crisp and impactful presentation. We'll need to understand who benefits, and so you'll need to articulate the market need and the population, describe the competitive landscape, both products that are on the market as well as those that are in clinical development, and to show us how you can differentiate your science from others that are out there. And then if this is more than just a single asset or a single molecule, if you have other molecules behind it or other indications that you could explore, describe that to the extent possible, because that means you would have a pipeline. Please don't show an overly detailed revenue forecast. It's very difficult to know all the assumptions in developing an early stage product. So keep it simple and try not to exaggerate, as we've all heard pitches that say that the products are going to be multi-billion-dollar products. We need to see there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and so we ask that you please design killer, no-go, go experiments so that we know there are bite-sized chunks and milestones that can be achieved to reach important value inflection points. This is very, very helpful, as often we do what's called a tranche financing, where you might have a total of $10 million, but 5 comes in initially to get to a certain point, and then the other 5 comes in after that. This creates a lot of discipline and focus. And then, of course, again, I'm a big fan of pursuing non-dilutive grant funding. Please don't be unrealistic about the potential challenges ahead, because there will be many, and most of us have been through drug development, and we know they're going to occur. So be honest about them, and try to raise what you need, but not overly extend the financing such that you become distracted. It's important to focus on what you really need to get to those value inflection points. Again, I would highly encourage you as a tip to initiate conversations with the FDA as soon as possible, especially if you've not had experience with the FDA before or there are no precedents. Please engage, regulatory consultants as early as possible. In terms of the right team for the job, this is very dependent on exactly where you are. But if you assume it's very early stage and you're still identifying molecules and thinking about what you need to do to start putting together pre-IND work, having that industry expertise is incredibly helpful. But keeping the team lean and nimble and surrounding yourself with advisors who are true champions and want to be involved because they believe in what you're doing and they truly believe they can be helpful. It's important to have the right team for the job, but you don't want to overemphasize advisors over your initial team, because your initial team will be the ones that ultimately get the job done. And again, I would keep the team as nimble as possible in that very beginning phase. Some final advice is don't expect an immediate answer from the venture group. And the reason is we're seeing hundreds and hundreds of business plans, ideas, and technologies over the course of a year, and we're only going to invest in 6 to 8. However, what I will tell you is if you begin receiving emails, phone calls after you've met with the venture fund, that's a very good sign. And don't be afraid to answer hard questions, because we will test you by asking those questions. And please be responsive. That's incredibly helpful. And understand that despite the fact there's a lot of money in biotech, biopharma right now, there's still quite a bit of competition, because the great news is that there's terrific academic science that's being developed and being funded by the NIH, and that's really fostering more and more company formation. Finally, please exude passion when telling your compelling story, and do a bit of homework yourself by researching the venture group, their specific partners' interests, the companies they've invested in before. So try to get to know them in whatever way you can in advance. That will be very helpful. Be prepared for follow-up and have a data room ready, because there's nothing worse than a venture group saying, we're interested, we'd like to see your data room tomorrow, and you say, we don't have a data room yet. So get that ready, and if you need help figuring out what that is, I know there'll be people that can help you along that journey. It's important to remain passionate and resilient and steadfast in your belief of the product that you have in order to further your science. It is quite the journey, but it's well worth it, because after all, it's all about the patients. Good luck on your journey.